have a variety of techniques that I use to deal with the ongoing, collapse of everything, most of them different kinds of drugs. But I also have some healthy habits like reading. And when it comes to reading purely for escapist pleasure, I find myself again and again turning back to Terry Pratchett's Discworld series. If you aren't familiar, Discworld is a sprawling collection of stories that blend fantasy, adventure, and satire, often with recurring characters popping up here and there. There are guides online to help people figure out what order to read them in, with some focusing on starting with the universally agreed upon best ones, others focusing on different character stories and following them through the years. When I started reading this series a few years ago, I took the completely insane tactic of reading them in the order that they were published and, not really thinking much about it. So yeah, so far I've enjoyed this approach. I highly recommend it to others. Because I am pretty much always now in the middle of a Discworld novel, I perked up to recently see an entire scientific study about the series. Detecting dementia using lexical analysis, Terry Pratchett's Discworld tells a more personal story, published last month in Brain Sciences. Now, this is old news, but it is a little sad, just as a warning. Terry Pratchett published 41 Discworld novels and even more one-offs between 1983 and 2015. In 2007, at the age of 59, he announced that he had been diagnosed with a rare form of early-onset Alzheimer's disease. He died in 2015 at the age of 66 from complications of that disease. Alzheimer's and other kinds of dementia can be difficult to diagnose before symptoms become very obvious and even life-altering, which leads to worse outcomes for patients who don't catch it early enough to do certain interventions that might benefit their lives. And so a lot of research has been done to figure out new ways to detect dementia as early as possible. One of these research avenues involves identifying very subtle shifts in the way a person uses language. And so back in 2005, neuroscientists decided to examine the works of novelist Iris Murdoch to see if they could detect changes in her writing throughout the span of her 40-year career. Murdoch's final novel was published in 1995, and it received uncharacteristically negative reviews. Shortly thereafter, she was diagnosed with Alzheimer's and died in 1999 at the age of 79. The researchers compared that last novel to her first novel, as well as one she wrote at the height of her career. And they found that whilst there were few disparities at the levels of overall structure and syntax, measures of lexical diversity and the lexical characteristics of these three texts varied markedly and in a consistent fashion. Her later work basically displayed a marked decrease in unique word choices relative to the overall word count. Building on that, in 2011, linguists performed a more robust analysis of Murdoch's novels and compared them to those of Agatha Christie, who was suspected but not diagnosed of having Alzheimer's, and P.D. James, who did not experience any cognitive decline over her 94 years. Their results supported the earlier study, and further, they seemed to be able to detect a more impoverished vocabulary in Murdoch's novels a full 30 years before her death. They also felt that they had convincing evidence that Agatha Christie did in fact suffer from Alzheimer's as well. So now it's not surprising that some researchers would want to perform a similar examination of Terry Pratchett, considering how many novels he produced, especially in that same universe, over the course of many decades. They chose 33 out of the 41 Discworld novels, excluding those that were very short and those written for young adults. And they looked for patterns in the vocabulary used. They found a significant decrease in lexical diversity across all word classes, beginning after the publication of The Last Continent in 1998, which was the 22nd book in the series and which was published 9.5 years before Terry Pratchett's diagnosis. So there we go. Pretty good evidence that it may be possible to diagnose Alzheimer's early using a careful examination of a history of the patient's writings, and surely we can apply this in the future to average people looking at their writings and emails and whatnot, right? No, Of course not. It's never that simple, is it? First, let me point out some criticisms I have seen come up quite frequently on social media about this study, and I'll use this post by Mark Burrows, who wrote a biography of Terry Pratchett, because he managed to hit them all. First, Burrows writes on Facebook, the point where this supposed decline begins is just before the strongest run of his entire career. A decade of book after book that includes Night Watch and Nation, two of the finest novels Sir Terry ever wrote. To argue that his writing was already deteriorating years before those books appeared just doesn't stand up. Okay, so that is not what this study or the previous studies were about. Yes, Murdoch's final novel was panned, but these studies do not have anything to say about the overall quality of the author's work. In fact, they are specifically looking for very subtle changes in word choice that literally require an algorithm to identify. The average person probably will not notice. Pratchett could very well have been using less diverse language while continuing to knock it out of the park when it comes to character development, storyline, and humor, especially this far into his career when he was firing on all cylinders otherwise. Burrows goes on, second, there's a far simpler explanation for a drop in adjective use. He was getting better. At this point, Sir Terry was writing at an astonishing rate, often 2 or 3 novels a year. His prose was getting cleaner and more disciplined. He was learning bit by bit not to let vocabulary get in the way of character, narrative, and theme. That's mastery, not decline, unless the argument is that Alzheimer's made him a better writer, which feels off. Well, it wasn't just adjectives. Again, it was all words, nouns, verbs, adjectives. Everything was found to get more and more simple, using fewer and fewer unique words as time went on. But otherwise, absolutely true. And that's why it completely negates his first point. You do not necessarily need a unique array of words in order to produce a great novel. Yes, and Pratchett very well may have made a conscious effort to change up his style. So, why didn't the researchers consider that? Simple. They did. In the discussion section of their paper, they include a lengthy list of reasons why this is not a slam dunk case of a decline in cognition. Age-related changes in writing style are expected, and it is possible that some of the observed changes represent natural stylistic evolution rather than disease-related decline. The authors also point out that after his diagnosis, Pratchett's language may have changed due to related factors like stress or just having less time to write. Burrows' third point is the big one. Sir Terry had posterior cortical atrophy, PCA, a very rare form of Alzheimer's that affects visual and spatial processing first. It isn't a language-led illness in its early stages, and it often doesn't touch memory or vocabulary for a long time. That's one reason it's so hard to diagnose. It doesn't work like other forms of dementia. When language problems do show up in PCA, they usually come via visual impairment, difficulty reading, scanning text, processing what's on the page, that sort of thing. Many of you will have seen the heartbreaking footage of Terry trying to read from Nation on stage at the Discworld con and complaining of shadows on the page. It can slow access to words, but it doesn't shrink vocabulary in this neat statistical way. Terry himself talked about this a lot. He took great pride in being able to rattle off long lists of words when he was being tested, while being unable to copy simple pictures. Even later on, when writing genuinely became a struggle, Rob Wilkins has been very clear that the issues were about keeping the shape of a story in his head and the character voices distinct, not about choosing words. And yet the articles making these claims don't mention PCA at all, which is extraordinary when you're citing scientific research and talking about the effects of a disease. They lump all forms of Alzheimer's together. That's also a great point. Why did these authors lump all forms of Alzheimer's together? They didn't. I'll give Burrows a break here because he does mention articles, so I'll assume that he was only reading some popular press about the study instead of reading the study itself, but which you should just read the study. It's available for free online. It's very easy to find. As always, links to everything I talk about can be found over at patreon.com/Rebecca or at skepchick.org. But if he is just criticizing the articles and not the study, I feel like it's important to actually call out what articles he's talking about and make it clear he's not talking about the study, because the authors do repeatedly point out that Pratchett had PCA. They cite research that found that in addition to the well-reported degradation of vision, literacy, and numeracy, PCA is characterized by progressive oral language dysfunction with prominent word retrieval difficulties. And then we're back to that discussion section where the authors state plainly that while PCA and Alzheimer's disease share some common features, and PCA is thought to be, in most cases, caused by Alzheimer's disease, they are distinct conditions with different clinical presentations. It is possible that the linguistic markers of PCA may differ from those of Alzheimer's disease. For example, PCA often causes severe reading impairments and pure alexia, which disrupts the writer's ability to visually scan and review their own text. Writers unable to effectively read their drafts may struggle to detect unwanted lexical repetitions and potentially may contribute to the observed decline in lexical richness. So yeah, I've seen those criticisms pop up a lot about this study, and I'm not impressed by any of them, seeing as one is just plain wrong and the others are quite obviously called out by the study authors themselves. The authors also point out that they could only judge the books based on the publishing dates, so they have no way to know when exactly Terry Pratchett wrote each book throughout his life. They also point out that unlike the 2011 study, they did not have a control author with no known problems with cognition. Essentially, this was just another case study to add to the data. That said, I will point out some critical thoughts that I had, particularly about the idea that research like this will allow earlier detection of conditions like Alzheimer's. While all of the writers discussed in these studies were diagnosed with Alzheimer's or strongly suspected by experts to have had it, or were a control, these changes in vocabulary do not point to Alzheimer's specifically. They point to cognitive decline, and that can mean about a zillion different diseases. Alzheimer's, yes, but also Huntington's disease, Parkinson's, dementia with Lewy bodies, depression, a concussion, even medication side effects. Even if we had a nice little private algorithm running in our email outboxes that can detect declining cognition long before we notice it ourselves, that would be a real, well, what the fuck do I do now situation. There would be a need to have a serious discussion about whether or not it makes sense to then run every test possible to try to narrow it down immediately, or whether you just have to wait and see what happens. Being terrified every time you walk into a room and forget what you were going in there for. I've talked in the past about the seemingly paradoxical problem of things like elective full-body MRIs, or even, getting your DNA data from companies like 23andMe. Sometimes more information is actually worse for us if it stresses us out, if it puts us through procedures that turn out to be useless. Sometimes ignorance is bliss and the healthy way to go. So it's an interesting study just for the sake of scientific inquiry, but I'm not sure that it should give anyone a lot of hope for a way to easily detect Alzheimer's anytime in the near future. And also, the takeaway of this study absolutely is not study pinpoints when Discworld fell off. I haven't even made it to the fan favorite golden age yet, but I'm pretty certain that Terry Pratchett could craft an entertaining story with nothing but a toddler's vocabulary. So personally, I'm not worried about it. Hey everybody, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. If you loved the video, please subscribe. And if you think the world could use more videos like this and you happen to have a few bucks laying around, head to patreon.com/Rebecca and join an awesome community of nerds like the people whose names you see on the screen right now. Thanks.